Stian van Draag on the line?
I'm on the line. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Stian. Do we have Vadakapat Nankumar on the line?
Yes. Good afternoon, Nankumar here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nankumar. Do we have Eric Hespenheide on the line? And do we have Eric Hespenheide?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And do we have Jürgen line?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you, Jürgen. Do we have Judy Kuszewski?
Yes, present.
Thank you. Do we have David Russell?
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Thank you. And Dwight Justice?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. And Hedemi Tumita?
Yes, I am on the line.
Thank you. And Daniel Ingram?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. And Daniel Talon?
Yes, present.
Thank you. And Michael Nugent?
Excuse me, yes.
Yeah, thank you. And Robin Matt Edme? Okay. And we have received apologies from Simeon Cheng and Sulema Pioli. And Eric, I hand over to you.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that, and appreciate the board members' attendance at today's call. We have as you see from the agenda, there's one principal topic that we want to cover, and we have dedicated the bulk of our meeting today on the topic of the management SRS. But to start things off, so we'll cover that. We have a couple of items here in the introductory section, one in particular. And to the extent that we have some time and we get through this, and we still have time on our allotted 2 hours, we'll take up some of the discussion for our next call, which will be on February 25th. And I think Chelsea will inform us of that. So, but first, let's start with and also a reminder that our meeting minutes will follow a 2-week delay, given, so we'll be approving our minutes from our last call last week on February 25th. So we'll see those minutes, shortly after this call, I assume, if that's correct, Secretariat.
Yes, it
is correct.
Okay, thank you. So you recall that on our last in our last meeting, we talked about the composition of the ad hoc committee for worker employee terminology. So Bastian, can you update us on that? And I think we'll need to take a formal approval by the board as to its composition.
Yes, thank you, Eric. So we have, as we've informed early on by email, composed this committee, and it is now complete from the perspective of the Standards Division, with Emily Sims from the ILO, Dwight Justice from the GSSB, and Alessandra Asenza from the IOE, the International Organization of Employers. This is in connection to last week's discussion, the moment to formally approve this membership of the committee. The GSSB has approved the terms of reference for the project and the project planning. This is now the next formal step in the due process to confirm this membership. I can read out the names again. It's Emily Sims from the ILO, Dwight Justice, and Alessandra Asenza.
Okay, so thank you. Entertain a motion for approval of this ad hoc committee.
So moved. This is Judy.
All right, is there a second?
I support. It's Theon.
Okay, thank you. Any questions or comments, discussion on the topic?
Nope.
Nope. Okay, hearing none. Any objections? Otherwise, rather than going through all the yeses, any objections? Hearing none, we'll approve the composition of the ad hoc committee for employee worker terminology. Thank you, Bastian. Another Another point I'd like to make before we get started is that in the interest of trying to make sure that all of our board members are heard from, if I fail to recognize your voice and call upon you, please send a chat message or send an email message, and we will strive to make sure that everyone is heard. I realize that using the technology we are, from time to time we have difficulty making our wishes known. So to the extent that you'd like to signal your desire to speak on a particular topic or respond to previous comments by other board members, either let me know orally. If I can't hear you, then chat, and if you're not in chat, then email, and we'll strive to make sure that all of our members, all of you, are heard from. So thank you for that. Another item just in this, we sent out a survey on the, if you recall, on our last meeting, we discussed the in accordance provisions. We sent out a short survey after the meeting trying to solicit the input from the board on that. We have at this point not received a response from all board members. So if I could ask you to please respond to that survey so that we can use that as a signal of our direction with regard to the in accordance provision. So Bash, anything, or Chelsea, anything to add on that at this point?
Well, yeah, I think.
Bastian?
Yes, Eric. So we have received only from a small set of members a reply, 5 in total. So we're looking forward to receive that feedback. And I think 2 out of the 5 members that have provided feedback already have signaled to us that they want further discussion on that subject matter. So it would be very good for us to have that feedback in a timely fashion. As we've pointed out last week, that depending on the decision of the GSB, that would require quite some replanning here at the standards division, and it would be good to have your input for this issue as soon as possible.
Okay, so I would ask the secretary to resend the survey request just in the event that it didn't end up in the right mailbox of the members or some other reason. And then please, we need to hear from all board members on this subject so we can provide the input to the secretariat and to the potential impact on our timeline. So please, I would ask at the conclusion of this meeting that you respond if you haven't already. Okay, so I would like us to, anything else, Bastian, from an introductory standpoint? Otherwise, we can get into the meat of the matter.
No, thank you, Eric. Okay,
so our second agenda item is the transition of the SRSs, in this case, the draft management approach. And appreciate the feedback that we've gotten from the board members on the survey instrument ahead of the call. It is just a reminder that is quite important and useful for us in terms of focusing our limited time together on these telephonic meetings. So with that, Laura, I think we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eric. Hello, everybody. This is Laura Spinac, and I will be introducing this session now. So we are looking at item 1, which is a draft of the management approach standard. So if you can have this item with you, that would be great, because we will be looking at specific sections of this document later on. We've also circulated the slides ahead of the call, so if you're joining via the phone, please have them in front of you to easily follow the presentation. What I will do is I will quickly summarize the changes that you can see in this draft. We've made quite a number of changes since you last saw this. Take enough time to go through them. And after that, I will summarize the feedback that we have received from the GSSB ahead of this call. And there are 2 points from your feedback that we would like to discuss with the full group. And after that, we will take additional comments or questions on this document. So in terms of the changes we've made, You last saw this management approach standard in November last year, and since then we have been working on implementing the feedback we received from you then, and we also held a consultation with one of the members, Dwight Justice, specifically on this issue. And there's a number of changes in terms of content. So the basis for this document is the disclosures on management approach from G4. So that is the 3 generic requirements for describing the management approach: why the topic is material, how the organization is managing the topic, and then the evaluation of the management approach. And those 3 requirements are for all of the material topics. So those 3 requirements are essentially the skeleton of this document. And we have also brought in the guidance for these 3 generic requirements into this document. And later on, I will explain how we have transitioned this guidance. In addition to the management approach disclosures, we have also included 2 other sets of content from G4. One is the boundary disclosures, G420 and G421, and the other one is the grievance mechanisms content from G4. So the boundary disclosures sit within the general disclosures in G4, and we have now made this move for 2 key reasons. One is that the team here believes that the description of where something is material, which is the boundary, should sit close to the description of why something is material. And the description of why something is material sits within the management approach. So that is one of the key reasons why we have decided to move this content into the management approach, because the 2 descriptions, why something is material and where, should sit close together. The other reason is that we've seen that the boundary disclosures are generally not well reported, and organizations typically provide a high-level overview of the boundary for all of the material topics at once, with no additional context or any link back to why something is material in the first place. So we think that by moving this content into the management approach, we will prompt more meaningful reporting on boundaries, and we will prompt a more cohesive discourse on why something is material, where is the topic material, what is the organization doing about it, and what are the results. Then for the grievance mechanism content, as you know, in G4 we have grievance mechanisms aspects under 4 categories: environmental, labor, human rights, and society. And the content across those 4 aspects is identical, which already gives an indication that these are generic questions that you could ask about any sustainability topic. But the main reason why we have decided to move this content is because, unlike other traditional aspects or topics like water emissions or child labor, grievance mechanisms are not a sustainability topic that should be subject to materiality. And instead, we believe that grievance mechanisms should be part of an organization's approach to manage a topic. And as you might know, the key purpose of a grievance mechanism is to identify impacts and to remediate them when they occur. And these are basic expectations of a due diligence process or an impact assessment process, and that belongs in the management approach. So that is the main reason why we've moved those disclosures into this document. Also, I want to make an additional note related to the grievance mechanisms. Earlier in the process, you might recall that the division had identified additional content from G4 that could potentially sit within the management approach standard, and that was content around supply chain due diligence and compliance, human rights, impact assessment, and so on. And the division looked at those contents again, following feedback from the GSSB. But we decided to transition these contents as topic standards for the moment. And that is because substantive revision on those contents would be needed to reword them into a management approach format. And that is outside of the scope of what we are tasked to do as part of this transition. However, we believe that the new structure we have put together now for the management approach would easily allow us to include additional management approach content in the future, should we wish to do that. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we have also included the guidance for the 3 generic requirements of the management approach into this document. And we went through that guidance, and on a case-by-case basis, we took a decision on the status of that content, and we decided whether it should be a requirement, using shall, recommendation, using should, or whether it should sit in guidance. And the bulk of the G4 guidance has been transitioned as guidance, and that is the text that you see with a light orange background in the document. But then there are 4 pieces of guidance that the team, also based on GSSB feedback, we decided to highlight as more important. And these 4 pieces of guidance now sit within the methodology section, and they include a mix of requirements, using shall, and recommendations, using should. And these are paragraphs 1.6 till 1.9, and we will be discussing those later on. But there is one piece of G4 guidance in particular that we thought was very important, and we decided to elevate that as a disclosure requirement. So what used to be G4DMA-B in G4, which is reporting how the organization manages the topic, now also includes a requirement to describe the components of the management approach based on the list we have on G4. So basically policies, specific actions, commitments, resources, and so on. And this move has also been made on the basis that we've seen that G4DMA-B is generally not well reported, and the existing requirement is not triggering enough detail from reporting organizations. And we believe that by at least requiring a description of the basic components of the management approach, we will see more meaningful reporting on the management approach going forward. If the organization does not have any of these components, it can use the reasons for omission as described in the in accordance criteria. Then in terms of the structure and the format of this document, we've used the template that you discussed last week. So we will be making the changes that we agreed to last week in the coming days. And we have also restructured the disclosure requirements so that they follow a more logical flow. And we have deleted some of the existing application in the boundary and in the grievance mechanisms content of G4. So that was the high-level summary of changes. Now we have received feedback ahead of the call on this document from most of the members. And first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to fill out the survey. And overall, we have seen very positive support for the new structure and format, which is fantastic. And all members that responded to the survey were in favor of the new structure and format, with the exception of a couple of members who were in favor with the structure but wanted to see a few amendments. Now, we have received a number of comments on the document. Some are very specific comments on how to improve the wording or how to reshuffle things to follow a more logical sequence. And those comments the division will implement in the coming days in consultation with specific members as needed. But those comments don't merit a discussion with the group now because they're very easy for us to implement, and we will be consulting with members as necessary. But there are two comments that were made for which we would like to have a discussion with the group now. One suggestion was to make all of the methodology statements, 1.6 till 1.9, a disclosure requirement. So that would mean taking those 4 statements and combining them with the existing disclosure requirements in this document. And the other suggestion that was made was to elevate the guidance on responsibilities and resources to the methodology section as a recommendation using should. So I suggest that we take one at a time. So for the first discussion point, I would like to take you to page 10 of item 1. And we're looking at paragraphs 1.6 till 1.9, and it starts on line number 151 until 162. So I repeat again, page 10, paragraphs 1.6 till 1.9, starting on line number 152. So this is content that comes from the guidance for the management approach in G4, and these are 4 statements that the division, also based on GSSB feedback, thought that are important enough to be highlighted as methodology requirements or recommendations. As you see, they include a mix of shalls and shoulds, and a couple of these statements are basically indications for how to go about reporting the management approach on specific situations. For example, when you don't have a management approach in place, or when you use a similar approach for different topics. And those are clauses 1.6 and 1.9. And the other 2 could be considered more like disclosure requirements that could be potentially added to the existing ones. Now, before making any changes, we wanted to see if there is full support within the GSSB for making these changes, and either moving all of it or portions of this content into the disclosure requirements. But we wanted the GSSB also to consider whether elevating all of this content as a disclosure requirement could be perceived as a significant content change compared with G4. And although this content is not new, it already exists in G4, we would be considerably adding to the number of disclosures that would need to be made for each material topic as part of the management approach narrative. So that is one thing we would also like you to consider now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Laura, for the overview. So to opening it up for questions or comments from the board members, again, signaling orally, and if that fails, signaling via chat, and if that fails, signaling by email would be appreciated. So,
Eric, this is Judy.
yes, Judy.
I just wanted to say I support this wording that's proposed. I think it's clear and is quite sensible, and I think it's in keeping with the original intention of G4. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Judy.
Kristen here.
Kristen, go ahead.
Yeah. I also support the current wording and the current use of shall and should. If we should change should to shall in line 154, that is in 1.7, I think we have to rewrite the statement, because should describe any processes it used to identify its impact, such as due diligence, sounds very strict. But saying shall describe the process it used to identify its impacts, such as due diligence, that works well. But the combination of shall and any processes is leaves too little room for sound judgment into the process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Just to clarify, Eric,
Yes.
what you have on the slide, this is the current proposal, but there was a comment made by a couple of members from the GSSB to move all of this content into the disclosure boxes that you have on the earlier pages in the document. So just to clarify that the question is whether we should retain this content within the methodology section or whether we should move this into the disclosure requirements.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
I have a question, Eric, if I may.
Michael, go ahead.
My question is, Laura, how do you see the difference between a shell in 1.6 and 1.9 and a requirement in the in the boxes above? To me, they're identical in meaning, so I don't understand the distinction you're making.
They are identical in meaning, but 1.6 and 1.9 are not widely applicable to all reporting organizations. So they are basically highlighting exceptions to the norm and how an organization should go about those exceptions. Now, when you look at the G4 guidelines, you see this type of statements within the indicators. So this is not consistent at the moment in G4. And that's why we're also raising this question now, whether we should have this type of exceptions highlighted within the disclosure requirements, or whether this is something that should only sit in methodology, and only if applicable, it should be complied with.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, Michael, go ahead.
I think they should be. I think this is quite a false distinction between disclosure requirements and methodology. These things are not methodology, they're disclosures. All of them in 1.6, 7, 8, and 9 are all what to disclose. It's not how to disclose it, which is what methodology implies. So I think, and I said this in my written comments last time, we didn't really get to talk about it, but it's part of a bigger thing to me, is I don't actually at all like this idea of distinguishing between disclosure requirements and methodology. I think most of the, or often, the methodology is actually a disclosure. So the distinction between the two, I just don't understand it, and I suspect other people, when they read this for the first time, won't either. So I fully support the idea of putting these up as requirements, because they, at least 1.6 and 1.9 are. And just another point of principle, I think 1.7 and 1.8 were in simple present tense verbs in G4, and to me, any simple present tense in G4 was intended as a requirement. So I'd move those I'd make them requirements as well.
Okay, thank you.
This is Daniel Tyland.
Yes, Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with the last comment. I would also support the idea of moving it into the required disclosure, and it sort of gets to the other point that I mentioned in my comments, getting to the idea that if the company does actually move forward with one of these issues or one of these methodologies, and then they're held accountable for it, whereas other companies may choose not to report because they don't want to address the issue, and they're not held in any way responsible for disclosing any of these methodologies. So I would definitely support the idea of moving it up to required disclosures.
Okay, thank you. Others comments on this?
Eric, it's Dion. I also
please
support moving it up into the requirements.
Okay, thank you.
David here.
Yes, David, go ahead.
Thank you. I also think these are requirements, and calling them methodology is rather confusing here, so I support moving them up as well.
Okay, thank you. Any of our board members who do not support?
I'm Nankumar here. I also support that this should be the disclosure requirements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any board members who would not support moving this into the requirements?
Kirsten here. again, I believe that 1.7 and 1.8 becomes way too strict if we put that as shall requirements. For 1.6 and 1.9, I have no problems.
And just to elaborate, because I'll just make sure I understand and for the benefit of everyone. So your concern is that it adds a potential level or barrier, or because of its complexity, or just the rigidness at which it would be viewed if it is a requirement?
Yeah, it's the rigidness. As I said, with 1.7, it can be avoided by rephrasing it, so that you don't have the level of detail that is currently there if we substitute should with shall.
Okay, thank you.
When it comes to 1.8, the reporting organization shall describe whether the management approach is intended to avoid, mitigate, or remediate negative impact or enhance positive impact. It could very easily be read that you need to use those words when you're describing it, and that could give a pretty rigid approach to the description. Thank you.
Jürgen, can I?
Jürgen, go ahead, please.
I find the arguments of removing methodology and put everything into the requirement, I find the argument in principle convincing, but I share the concern that making 1.7 and 1.8 a must, replacing should by shall, is too rigid. And I find that really a bit worrying, that we demand too much. I don't know if a compromise is possible with that respect, to keep 1.7 and 1.8 out and to keep it a recommendation in the form of should.
Eric, this is Chelsea here. I think that that's possible, certainly from a draft proposal standpoint. We can mock that up. One potential thing to be aware of is that in bringing in 1.6 and 1.9, or all four, into the disclosures, although we are being more explicit about what is intended with the DMA, we are also significantly increasing its length and complexity. So for reporters who are used to having that very short, succinct DMA without the associated guidance, it will look and feel quite different. And that was a concern raised by the GSSB on the last call, and it's something that we should be aware of and be managing as we go forward.
Okay, thank you.
Eric, I'd like to ask a point of principle on this.
Yeah, Michael, go ahead. I would ask you, if you, once you signal that you'd like to, if you'd wait for my acknowledgement, just so we can be clear as to who's speaking, I'd appreciate it. So go ahead, Michael.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought anything that was in a simple present tense in the G4, like, you know, where it says identify X or provide Y or report Z, that was in G4 basically the equivalent of a requirement. So when we talk about increasing the burden, in my mind, we're actually decreasing the burden if we change simple present tenses into shoulds or cans. So my understanding obviously is different from other people's, it seems. So I'd just like, is that true that my understanding is quite different from other people's? Are other people not interpreting a simple present tense as a requirement in G4?
Well, this is Bastian. I think when you look at how, well, at the legacy, where content is coming from, it was in G3 developed as a methodology section. The identifier in particular was basically a repeat of the disclosure and to walk the practitioners through steps to complete the disclosure. So it is indeed true. They were formulated in a way that they could now be interpreted as a requirement. But I think the intent was different back then. This was basically a disclosure set out and then steps to complete the disclosure under the methodology. And what we are trying to do now as part of this process is to sort out which contents under the methodology in G4 that mostly date back to G3 are indeed of the nature that they have to be put into a disclosure or lifted to the disclosure element. But for the bulk of the contents, we are concluding that they're not disclosures, and we keep them in the methodology. I think, in principle, your observation is right. However, the history of that document, I think if we were to start this process now, we would probably approach it the way you describe it. But this was not done in the past.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? So, what is your sense, Bastian, in terms of, or Laura, in terms of where we want to take this? Because as a board member, my own view is that I also struggle with the idea that we would have shall or even should statements in methodology. It strikes me that if what these are intended to do, which is how I interpret them, is to be expansive of what is intended by the required disclosure, it would seem to me that language, for instance, on 1.7, if we're using due diligence as an example of what an organization would be doing to describe their processes. Arguably there are others. So Bastian, was the intent that this methodology was intended when it was in G3 and carried over in G4 to just provide the further elaboration on what is intended by the required disclosure?
Yeah, that was indeed the aim back then. But again, lots of the contents were also inherited, also in the DMA, and there was always this mix. So now is the opportunity to separate that out. I think we can proceed to move this to the disclosure. As Chelsea has pointed out a moment ago, it requires communication around it to avoid the impression that there are now a number of additional disclosure requirements. And I think, it will probably strengthen overall our messaging around what we're trying to do here with the transition to standards, to clearly spell out what is indeed a requirement and leave out the other things and give them a different home. But to conclude, it's important for us at this stage is to conclusion around the 1.7 and 1.8 and whether this is indeed something that should move up. I've heard two comments there, and I think one is that it could, we can model that as a shell, but then it would need some wording changes in 1.7 and 1.8. If we have more specific guidance on that, that will be helpful, because then we do that in one go and present a complete DMA standard next time.
So, Bastian, just a further question, just specifically on 1.8, where we say, describe where they manage, would that be solved, at least potentially? Maybe it's again, saying that we're changing the intent. But if you look at the list under paragraph or in line 147, paragraph 1.3, where disclosure 301-3 is described. If one were to add I guess would be an 8th item, which says description of intent of the management approach, because that's all we're describing there, right? In 1.8 is whether, what the intent of the management approach is. Would that not be solved by just adding another item under, perhaps an elaboration under policy as to, what are you trying to solve for here? Because that's, as I read it, that's all we're trying to get at in 1.8.
Yeah, it isn't. Well, it is indeed true that this could probably be simplified and weaved into the existing disclosure. Yeah, we can have a look at that. Yeah.
And then, you know, if a need be under guidance, you could just make in guidance where you have examples of what is meant by intent. And you have this, which I think would address, at least as I heard Michael's, potentially Michael's concerns about mixing, and others in terms of mixing a requirement with guidance, which is just a, you know, separating the what, you know, from the how.
Okay.
Kirsten
Kirsten,
here.
go ahead.
I support to do something like what Eric said, if we should put this up as mandatory or as requirements. But when it comes to the 1.8 itself, isn't that really about explaining why this is material? And then it is already covered by disclosure 301/1. Thank you.
Sorry, Robin, joining. Sorry being late. I had problems in connecting.
Oh, Robin, thank you for joining. Okay, so looping back. So Bastian, we have enough to go on.
Well, I think the 2 pointers now. You have a specific suggestion for 1.8, and to Kirsten's point, we have to look at the overlap of the contents in 1.7 and 1.8 when we bring that back in the on the disclosure level to avoid that we have basically twice the same content in the disclosures. And we will then also look at the implications of making 1.7 in particular a shell statement. And I suggest that we go back to Kirsten for specific commentary on the wording, because she has raised that both in the survey and now in the call as an issue to look at.
Okay, so any other closing comments on this topic? No? Okay, thank you. Laura?
Okay, thank you. The next and last point we wanted to discuss is a comment to elevate the guidance on responsibilities and resources into the methodology section as a recommendation using should. So I would like now to take you to page 12 within item 1. And within that page, we are looking at the first 2 sections on responsibilities and resources. So this guidance is basically high-level guidance on describing who is responsible for the material topic and whether responsibility is linked to performance assessments and incentive mechanisms, and then a bit more guidance on what are the resources that have been allocated for managing the material topic and the rationale for that allocation. So the suggestion was to move this content into the methodology section as a recommendation. And we would like to know whether there is full support within the GSSB for this change. But also we wanted the GSSB to consider whether these are the only 2 elements within guidance that should be elevated as a recommendation. Thank you.
How are we going to make that distinction in elevating stuff from guidance to methodology?
We're making this on a case-by-case basis. So basically on the initiative of the standards division, but also based on feedback from GSSB members.
Yeah, so I think to answer the question, right, it's our conversation now and ultimately deciding, what we want to do with this. On essentially a case-by-case basis, I would say. So other comments with regard to the question at hand?
Jürgen, can I?
Yeah, Jürgen, go ahead.
I just consider these 2 issues, responsibilities and resources, too important to leave it to the discretion of the reporting organization. I think they are important enough that we as the GRI should make at least a recommendation to deal with them appropriately. And therefore should is more appropriate than can.
Okay, thank you.
This is Daniel. I'd like to weigh in at one point.
Okay, Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, in principle, I would also support moving this from guidance to a should. One question I have though is, what about the rest of our guidance? Do we need to be going through and seeing where we need to move other things up, and what criteria are we using to determine what gets considered by the GSSB, or is this something that, as it comes up, we will discuss this, and I'm not sure how we make that decision to move something from guidance to should, which again, I don't oppose in this case. I'm just wondering, there might not be other things that we should be also moving up.
So in answer to your question, that is entirely likely. So I don't know, Laura or Bastian, if you want to respond, but it would strike me that as we go through this, that's precisely, what we would have in this situation, as we will in the future and have dealt with in the past, or as the Secretariat has identified, from their, guidance, we provided the framework for how we're going to make this transition. In exercising, going through that exercise, they're flagging things like this for us. And so, unless I'm mistaken, this is what we'll do is, to the extent that we see as the Secretariat sees, or that we as board members see as we make these transitions to the standards, where there is this question of guidance and should it be a requirement, will come up. So, I don't know, Bastian or Laura?
Eric, this is Chelsea here. I'll jump in on that. I think you've identified really the fundamental biggest challenge in this project for us from the GRI side is trying to take inherited content from the implementation manual and sift through it to determine what was originally intended and still stands as a valid requirement, and what was originally intended and still should be a softer recommendation or contextual example. So this is exactly why in the drafts that you guys have seen to date, and you will be getting another set of them today, we are highlighting for you with a lot of care from the department the changes in instructive verbs along with the original text from G4. And we are asking for the GSSB particularly to be reviewing the instructive verbs for anything that we have elevated beyond guidance. But at the same time, as you're reviewing the guidance sections, there's definitely a desire for you to identify anything you think should be a requirement. So that is the process we have been going through. If there are better ways for us to tackle that going forward, I think certainly we'd be open for them.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of, just to clarify, from my perspective, to clarify. So this is a case, where we're going to have to address this, as mentioned. The Secretariat will take their, as they make this transition, and as Chelsea has identified, this is one of the more difficult ones. They will flag it for us, and we will discuss it such as we have. So that's sort of the process. I guess to get back now to the specifics as it relates to this particular instance, maybe we could have some more further discussion on that. Did I hear someone?
It was Michael.
Michael, go ahead.
It was more the general point, sorry, so if you don't want to discuss that. My question was whether there is any criteria that the team are applying when they decide to move things up or down.
Common sense.
Okay, that makes common sense. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it just, because I think, there's not an easy way to answer that question, Michael, because it requires reading it and now knowing a sense as to how we are trying to differentiate between requirements and guidance in a much more, I would say, rigid fashion than perhaps were applied ultimately within the G4 or G3. So these are, they're reading it and saying, gosh, this could be viewed one way or the other, but let's flag it and bring it up. So I would put it in the category of common sense.
Eric, one follow-up to that. This is Chelsea. I would say we're trying to take a bit of a conservative approach, which is that because we don't know in all cases the legacy or the context behind the existing content, where there is a question about it, we have tried to be a little bit softer rather than making things that are ambiguous a hard requirement. And that is where definitely the GSSB input is appreciated going forward. But given that a lot of this content is in the implementation manual, which is only being used in less than half the cases that the guidelines are being at least downloaded, a lot of it will possibly be still perceived as new content or additional content to users. And that may be a good thing, but it also will be a bit of a change.
Can I comment again, please?
I'm sorry, Michael and then Kirsten.
Just when this was written in G3 and then G4, I must admit, as a TAC member, I had it in my mind that if it used simple present tense, it was a requirement, as I mentioned before, and so that would be the criteria I would apply. But obviously, what I'm hearing is that would make it far too onerous. The standard's far too onerous. I think that's what I'm hearing. But I don't know that I would then try and be conservative and have fewer requirements. So the TAC never saw the split between what went into the front part and what went into the back part of G4. So if we're trying to work out what the intent was at the time, I would have thought simple present tense versus words like may and can in the text would be the criteria. But anyhow, that's my view.
Okay, thank you. Kirsten?
I agree with, was it Chelsea we heard prior to Michael?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, I was just asking if it was Chelsea that was talking before Michael. Yeah.
Yes, it was Chelsea.
I certainly support what Chelsea said about being very careful in making this revision feeling more onerous, more rigorous to the reporting organization. What we should try to do now is to make the GRI framework, or from framework to standards, by doing it more explicit, clearer to follow, and less uncertainty. But we have to, at the same time, we have to be careful not to increasing the burden, because that could really become a challenge in going forward. We are making a change now that should be structural, only be structural, and we have to make sure we don't put extra burden to the reporting requirements. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I think and I think was Chelsea highlighted it, is one of the challenges is that, while it may have appeared in guidance, it carried language in G4 that if it was actually read, one could interpret it as a requirement, not just guidance. So I do think, I acknowledge that there will be some challenge here, but I think what we have to deal with is, and it is going to have to be, I suspect on a case-by-case basis, where are those things that intentionally, or the intention was that we would see it in a disclosure. And I think, will leave us potentially with will relieve us with a communication and a transition challenge in terms of explaining to people how we have gotten to where we are. And that's where the mapping of the G4 to all of our standard requirements as opposed to guidance will come from. But so I think we've heard in terms of what the criteria could be going forward. I think just to bring us back to the here and now, we have a specific example of what we're talking about in terms of whether it's a requirement or whether it's guidance. So Unless there's some further comment on the general approach, I think we should spend some time on the specifics here.
Yeah, one more comment from Kirsten on
Okay, go ahead.
general approach. Yeah, in
Yes,
my
go ahead.
opinion, as long as it has been in the guidance document, we cannot claim that it was a requirement or that that somebody remembers it like having been thought about as a requirement isn't good enough for me, as long as it was listed in the guidance document. And as has been said several times, the guidance documents have not been very much read and very much used, but the real requirements have been in the main document. Thank you. And that is what we should follow up on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So other comments? Okay, so if we could get down to the specifics. So acknowledging, Christian, exactly what you just said, we are, as we have discussed at prior meetings, faced with a bit of a dilemma as to whether we do indeed want to perhaps move beyond the prime objective of just transition, no change, or so on, or what might be perceived as a change. We are faced with the responsibility for ensuring that what we're publishing and what we're going to then ask people to do makes sense and is as comprehensive of our intent as is possible. So it strikes me that we still need to have the conversation. I don't know that we could or should take a blanket of saying just because it was in the second document means it can't come forward. I don't think would necessarily serve our interests or the interests of what we're trying to accomplish on an overall basis. It does create the challenge of the perception of additional disclosure requirements. And I think on a specific basis, we can weigh that as to whether on the specifics, such as we have in front of us, whether this is going to, the weight of that is going to be perceived as additional and burdensome as opposed to just an additional clarification of what we actually intended or is thought to be. So one question I would ask the Secretariat in relation to the specifics that are in front of us on this particular standard is whether from a practical standpoint we're seeing confusion or a lack of, we've noted before the lack of the fact that people don't download the guidance, which is potentially an indication that they haven't addressed what we have in the guidance as they prepared their G4 report. But I guess the question is there any practical evidence that says that, in this narrow case of these responsibilities and resources, that people actually are making those disclosures, and this is simply going to line practice up with what we are intending to, or potentially intending to be a requirement. So, Bastian, Chelsea, anybody?
Can you please unmute? Yes, this is Bastian. So we don't have evidence in terms of research that was done on that particular subject matter.
Okay. Because I want to be sensitive to what Christian has said, which is, we want to avoid the appearance or even the appearance, but certainly the reality of making this more burdensome. So I'm trying to just understand whether there is any anecdotal evidence or statistical evidence that would support. So in light of that, perhaps I would ask, and I realize it's potentially additional burden, that the Secretariat include any sort of practical, either by way of the Q&A or other sources of how what we're suggesting has played out in reality, particularly on something like this, where there is some sense, and I do get some sense from the members of the board, that we should move these to require, these particular responsibility and resources to requirements as to what the practical implication of that is in terms of perception of additional burden. If people are doing it already, then it isn't, and if they aren't, then perhaps it is.
Eric, this is
so. Laura, maybe you could restate the specific question that we're seeking the board's view on.
Eric, this is Chelsea here first. Just a quick follow-up on that request. We will do some research over the next few weeks on the specific reporting against the DMA and whether or not some of these subcomponents are being included or not included in reports that we're seeing now. So the next time that we present this back to the GSSB, we will also have a better baseline understanding of whether including some of this content will actually change the bar. We suspect it will, but whether or not that's a good thing or not is the discussion maybe to have then.
Okay.
Laura, the specific point?
Yeah, so the specific question we had is, well, whether these two pieces of guidance on responsibilities and resources should be elevated to the methodology section, but also whether there are other pieces of guidance in this document that should be also elevated as a recommendation.
Okay, thank you. So that's a specific question the Secretary is seeking some the views of the board on as it relates to this in a specific example. So, response, questions?
No, that's okay.
I'm sorry, who was that?
Jürgen said, I find this okay, that's a good proposal. Let's proceed this way.
Okay, thank you, Jürgen. Other views? So let me ask, does anyone object to what has been proposed for these two specific elements?
Responsibilities makes more sense than the resources.
I'm sorry,
I guess.
Michael.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Michael,
yes.
Go ahead.
Sorry. The elevating responsibilities makes more sense than resources, but that's just reading what's there. It just seems more like a standard, the responsibilities one than the resources one, but it's not an area in which I'm particularly knowledgeable.
Okay, thank you. Other reactions? Okay, I'm not. So yeah, it is, you know, and I guess, you know, Michael, to your point, I also see a distinction between responsibilities as being, you know, sort of the requirement part of it. Resources, you know, I could easily see that as staying in the methodology or the guidance. But other views? Okay. So let me ask the other question, which Laura asked, which is the open-ended question. Are there other elements of the guidance that should be considered or that we ought to consider to be moved to the methodology section as a recommendation?
This is Dwight. I
Go
have a concern, and I think listening to the discussion, this is the place to make the concern in the form of a suggestion of moving. But basically, let me just explain the concern. In 3013, there's a list of different possibilities of a way management might approach something, which the third is grievance mechanisms. Then 3014 is a disclosure that is dedicated to grievance mechanisms. Then if you go back, you find, of course, two sections of guidance on grievance mechanisms. There's one for 3013 and one for 3014. Now, if you then go to 3014, which is about grievance mechanisms, what appears as the disclosure is in fact an indicator, a quantifiable indicator that I think has appeared someplace. Now, the problem is that the whole idea of the management approach disclosure is to avoid to avoid some of the problems that quantifiable indicators create, because A, sometimes they need to be explained, and B, sometimes they're just not what the information is that needs to be disclosed. What needs to be disclosed is more of a narrative, and that's why the management approach was established. Now, I think the first thing, and I've got about 3 things to say. One is this indicator in 3014 is not right. It doesn't belong in the management approach disclosure. It can be, for instance, moved back to guidance if there's no other place in our standards that have that. But I think what needs to be in the disclosure is a more useful description of what the grievance mechanism is. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, what is the purpose of the grievance mechanism? What's the scope of it? Who is it intended for? And those sorts of questions, the very basic questions about the grievance mechanism. And these questions are disclosed through a narrative. They're not disclosed through some kind of quantifiable indicator. So the narrative about the grievance mechanism needs to be elicited at that point, and it's not this indicator. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, in looking at the guidance, I got a little confused because I read the grievance section for 3013, and then later on I read the grievance section for 3014, and I got a little confused. And I think that it would be easier to understand if the guidance on the grievance mechanism was only in one place, in 3014, which is dedicated to the grievance mechanism. So therefore, I would sort of not have 2 forms of guidance. I would probably have in 3013 a reference to 3014. So it basically says, if the management approach includes the following, please provide a description of each. I'd just say I would reference grievance mechanisms to the more detailed disclosure in 3014. But then I think there needs to be some work on what the guidance is for grievance mechanisms, because I think it's sort of insufficient guidance, and it's also an insufficient disclosure. Now, does any of this change what was in G4, or does any of it have an additional burden? I suspect not, for 2 reasons. One is, in both cases, it's preceded by if. If you have this, then you describe it. So presumably under the G4, that was also the case, that you were expected to describe these things where they existed. And the other thing was that I think the kind of clarification I'm asking doesn't increase the burden. It just asks the question in a clearer way, I think, so that the reporter can understand what is wanted by a narrative that's already required if something exists. So I don't think it necessarily increases the burden, but I do think this needs to be sort of reshuffled, and I think that this might be the point to mention this.
It is. So thank you, Dwight. I appreciate those comments. If I could ask, the secretary to respond, if, as you saw in the document, the base document that we're talking about, that this particular content under disclosure 3014 was in fact moved here under management approach. And I thank you for raising the question, Dwight, in terms of having a quantitative information in what otherwise is a narrative description of what we have. So,
can you put me in line as well, Eric? Sorry.
Yes, I will, Daniel. Thank you. So, if I could ask, the Secretary to respond as to the placement of this and their views as to this question of having guidance on grievance mechanisms in two different places.
And this is Laura from the Secretariat. I think what Dwight proposed is definitely workable, and we can try and implement those changes for the next iteration of this draft. However, that would entail either deleting the indicator permanently or moving this elsewhere. And currently, we don't have a home for this content because we are proposing to discontinue grievance mechanisms as separate aspects. So the only home for this content would be either the general disclosures or somewhere in guidance within this management approach standard, although it wouldn't be optimal. So I think we would like to hear from the GSSB as to whether you would be comfortable with eliminating this quantitative indicator on grievances.
And to add to that, Sebastian, provided that we can add to the existing contents guidance on the grievance mechanism, so that this becomes more comprehensive and complete. That would be, I think, the alternative to having an indicator covering grievance mechanism.
Okay, thank you. So Daniel?
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in because really grievance mechanisms is something that has evolved very substantially in the past few years. While we were coming up with the latest reiteration of the guidelines, we were just beginning to incorporate the whole work by John Ruggie and a number of other people on the UN framework, which includes grievance mechanisms as one element. And this has really been consolidated in the last few years. And so it's not surprising that we today have something that looks like we've dealt with it a little bit haphazardly as it became a priority. I think this is a very important future part of our work, and it does need to be prioritized, and I think we need to flag it as such. And for me, it's very important that we devote the proper attention to this and give it prominence in the guidelines. And that's one of the points that I brought up when I looked at this document. As it currently reads, it really only becomes a reporting requirement for those who have chosen to have grievance mechanisms. And I think the expectations in the public realm is much larger than that. So I think we need to deal with that somehow.
Here.
Okay, thank you. So Kirsten, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the comments from both Dwight and Daniel are very important and very valid. In addition, I would just like to say that the way it is organized here, it's probably something about a bit old-fashioned approach that Daniel is referring to. It sounds like you would typically have one sort of grievance mechanism for environment, another for social aspects, etc., etc., etc. While in reality, you would probably normally have just one way of one. You can have many different mechanisms, but they will all be able to handle all kind of issues. So the channels will depend on which users or which audience of you are working towards through the grievance mechanism. And it seems a bit rigid and old-fashioned. So I think we have to have a look at it, and at least as a minimum say that as it's opened up in 1.6, line 152, that if certain management approach disclosures are combined for a group of topics, the reporting organization shall state clearly which topics are covered by each disclosure. We need to get that understanding already when we're talking about the reporting on the grievance mechanism. Because now it sounds like you should repeat it for whatever topic you are on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? Okay. So I would, so we, this is another example of, we run the risk of significantly or being perceived as to changing things in terms of G4 content, while we would potentially view it as a improvement and a recognition that in the 3 or 5 years since this thing was last drafted and thought about and so on in any great detail, that the world has moved. So maybe we could parse the question a little bit to get at what Laura's, whether we have previously had an indication that we were going to eliminate grievance mechanisms as an aspect or a topic. I guess the question is it of such a nature and pervasiveness, perhaps in today's world, that it should be addressed separately in some form or fashion, thereby allowing for an elaboration of the, as Kirsten just described, all the different elements. If you're a supplier, if you're an employee, if you're the member of the public, many organizations now have one process or one source of where you can lodge your grievance or observation complaint, but depending on the topic, it gets routed and it's handled in different ways. But so I guess I'm looking for a way forward here. I am a bit hesitant to put indicators and quantification into something that is otherwise qualitative and descriptive in nature, narrative in nature. But I understand the reason why we have it here, because we don't have any place else to put it. But I don't think that's potentially a good enough reason. So maybe we need to rethink where we would have a more thorough. I think we can have a thorough description of our grievance mechanism, but I guess the question, back to what Laura had asked, is, do we feel that compelled to have any of the statistics associated with grievance mechanism, somewhere in a report?
Yeah, and this is Bastian. Eric, also to highlight in this context that this question of materiality and does it apply to management approach components like grievance mechanisms. There is a structural element here that we're trying to address, because there is a risk that we're setting out topic standards in the new structure that are not actually a sustainability topic or impact. And so that is, I think, the overarching and underlying concern from the standards division. When it comes to placing these contents, there is probably we're seeing at least two options here. One is to look again at the general disclosures and find a hope within that. We have disclosures of similar nature in a way under the ethics and integrity. So that is in principle possible. The other option is to really look at the disclosure that we have here, the indicator I'm referring to, take at face value what the actual contents are and the intent behind the contents, and write it up in a way that it complements a management approach disclosure. So foregoing the quantitative nature of grievance mechanism disclosure, but keeping the core contents in form of a management approach disclosures. These are, I think, the two viable options that the team here is seeing at the moment.
This is Dwight.
Dwight, go ahead.
I think that grievance mechanisms belong in the management approach, and I think that we identify. I agree with the decision to put them there, that they occurred in 4 different places. They could conceivably be useful in other places. There might even be a demand for grievance mechanisms in different topics. But the essence of the grievance mechanism is a process, and it's more fairly described as a management approach. That's the first thing. The second thing is the nature of the grievance mechanism is the most important thing that should be disclosed, meaning that it's important to understand what it's about, what its purpose is, who it applies to, how it is used to manage whatever topic, or whether it's used to manage more than one topic. All of those things are narrative, and that's the most important information. And I think that's why that's the second reason it belongs in a management approach. I would not have a problem if we wanted to, deal with this later, and in the process of the transition to standards project, put the suggested indicator in the guidance for the management approach, saying that this indicator might be something that you might want to use if you want to in terms of performance measurement or something like that, and that's what it's used for. But I don't think it's the essential information. The essential information is the quality of the mechanism, and how it is, and what topic it's used for, and how it's used.
Okay. Other views?
David here.
Yes, David, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Dwight has summed it up very nicely there, that this is really important. It needs to be discussed as part of the policy of the organization, and how that's implemented needs to be described. The specific statistics around there are not the meaty part of this. And so having those as something that's ancillary, as a guidance of how this might be reported, is something that I could support. I think that what's important here is the description, the fact that an organization has it, how they approach this, how they deal with it. That's the key part.
Yeah, okay.
Well, it's supported by me too, Kirsten.
Okay, Kristen, go ahead.
Yeah, that was all.
Okay.
I support what Dwight and Michael have said. Mm.
Okay, thank you.
This is Judy.
Yes, Judy.
I also support what Michael and Dwight have both put forward on this. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Nankumar here. I too support the Michael's proposition. Thank you.
Okay.
It is Stian. I'm also in support.
Okay. So I guess at this point, I'll just ask the secretary to summarize what they believe, that Dwight's quote unquote position is, and what that will mean for, the next iteration.
Yeah, so this is Laura. So following Dwight's suggestion, we will work on rephrasing disclosure 3014 as a narrative requirement on the grievance mechanisms, based on a description of the mechanism and the quality of that mechanism. So asking for a description of the intent, purpose, scope, and who are the intended users of the mechanism. And then we would move the statistics or the quantitative requirement into the guidance as something that organizations might want to use as a performance measurement, but it won't be a hard requirement for organizations. And we will need to work with Dwight in the next few days to try and craft this disclosure as best as possible. But that's basically what we've heard here at the Secretariat.
Okay, good. Any elaboration, any comments from the board with regard to that course of action? And it mostly falls, Dwight, the burden on you. So I appreciate.
It's not a problem.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay. So Laura, anything else with regard to the specifics on?
Yeah, if we could go back to the initial question. So I think there's general support from the GSSB in making the guidance on responsibilities and resources a recommendation within methodology. But the question we had here in the Secretariat is whether there are other elements within the guidance that should be elevated as a recommendation, because it might look a bit arbitrary to only highlight responsibilities and resources and not policies or specific actions or any of the other elements we have in guidance.
Okay. I believe I've seen some comments through chat from various board members that they would like to pick up on that question now in light of the conversation we've had regarding how we're thinking about all of this and asking that they would respond in due course. But having said that, are there any comments from board members currently with regard to the question? So so my interpretation of this is that I would not take silence as there aren't any. I would take silence as in light of the conversation, there may well be some additional commentary on the question, Laura. So unfortunately, I don't know that anyone who is prepared should speak up now, but if I would not take silence as no one has any comments, because I believe that it's going to be reread in light of our conversation. Yeah.
This is Chelsea here from the Secretariat. Just a comment on that. We always appreciate this follow-up offline, more detailed read-through and comments. But I'm also monitoring the timeline for getting these drafts prepared very carefully. So we would ask that if you have further suggestions on changes related to the management approach, that you send those to Lara within the next week, because that allows us to then close off that draft, and we will be working on, as you'll see later today, another set of 4 to 6 papers in the next week or 2 weeks. So very much appreciate your time on that. But if it can happen in the next week, that will give us a chance to incorporate your feedback.
Okay, thank you.
Eric, can I make a comment?
Michael, go ahead.
Just in relation to that, I've got some, we didn't really get to them in last week's call. I've got some comments about structure of the standards. Is now an appropriate time to raise them?
If you would just hold that for a moment, it's fine. I mean, we have time remaining in our agenda. I just want any other comments with regard to the specifics around this that Chelsea just described. Okay, so Laura, anything else on this particular question? Otherwise, we'll move to other business.
No, that's it. Thank you so much. Okay,
thank you. Okay, so thank you for that conversation, and I think it's illustrative of the fact that there are, as we dig deeper, oftentimes we end up with additional questions. But in being sensitive to the timeline, to the extent that we can, in light of our conversation, then I would ask all the board members to go back and reread or rethink about our topic here and submit those to the Secretariat so we can hopefully be respectful of our timeline and get this forward. So let's pick up with other matters. So Michael, if you have a specific question or thoughts with regard to structure, now would be a good time. So go ahead.
Okay, thank you. It's fairly fundamental, actually. I'm a bit confused about this structure of having standards at the front. I understand that, having guidance at the back. It's the bit in the middle I don't understand. If we're ordering it by authority, standards at the front, guidance at the back, then presumably we should have recommendations in the middle. If we're ordering it by nature, then we've got what we're calling disclosure standards, and then we've got what we call methodology, but they're actually disclosure things. So I don't know the nature of what's in the middle there. It would make sense to me to have all standards in the front, all guidance down the back, and have recommendations in the middle, if that's how we want to do it. But I don't understand what the criteria is for putting things in the middle at the moment, because it's called methodology, but it's not. So I just don't get it, and I suspect other people will have trouble when they see these for the first time as well. So that's one point. Another one is in the requirements bit. I don't know why we have I can't understand having boxes to make it look, stand out or whatever. But why do we need separate numbering series? Why can't we just have paragraph 1, 1.1, and it says the organisation shall report material topics or whatever it says, rather than saying with that, I think Judy called it robotic language, the organisation must report the following, and then in a box, what's material or whatever. So and I just would find it a lot easier if things were just paragraph numbered, and rather than having a separate series of numbers or requirements. So they're just a couple of things. And another one is that the guidance, I find it difficult to identify what I'm talking about in the guidance because they're not paragraph numbered. So I've had paragraph numbers in there as well. So there you go.
Okay, thank you.
Eric, this is Chelsea here from the Secretariat. I can address, I think, the first and the third point, and I'll defer to Bastian on the second one. Regarding the distinction between disclosures and methodology, it is one of the challenges that we're finding here as well. Some of the things that have been in the compilation sections in the implementation manual do in fact relate closer to disclosures. But as we talked with the GSSB about earlier today, we are also trying to be conscientious about not creating multiple new indicators under each standard as we start to revive or clarify that content. One of the things that we are asking GSSB input on in the next set of papers, which will come out today, is whether we should lose those subheadings. So we will not have disclosure requirements section or methodology. You would just have requirements. Some of them relate to specific disclosures, and some of them are more around how to disclose information. So that may get, Michael, to your point about not creating artificial distinctions. That might certainly help us make a more future-proof structure as well. Regarding the numbering of guidance, it is something we should look into. So certainly we can either look at numbering within the guidance, or we can relate sections of guidance more clearly to the requirement or clause numbers in the standard. And we can mock up a couple of versions of that for future review by the GSSB, if that would be useful. Over to Bastian to address your second point.
Yes, and that was related to the what I would refer to the unique identifiers of the disclosures, and these boxes have basically a unique code now in the structure that is set out, and it is always introduced with a sentence that clearly distinguishes these contents also. But the unique identifier is there for the reason that right now we have the issue that disclosures based on the GRI guidelines are hard to trace back in real life later on. And given the nature and use of these disclosures, that what we foresee for the future is that organizations will use these documents in different ways. Hopefully many will continue to issue sustainability reports eventually. But there will be other uses for this, and it will be important to identify the disclosures that the organizations have in any particular case been responding to. And that's the reason for these unique identifiers. When you look, for example, at XBRL solutions that we have developed in the past that would make technical solutions that work with the disclosures of the GI standards going forward as a basis a lot more easier to scale and also to I think build out over time with the evolving standards. If we don't have these unique identifiers and we just work with our own basically document-led line numbering system, then you lose that element, and once it is taken out of that context, people can probably refer to, okay, this is disclosure line SRS 101, line 100 to 105. That's not particularly useful in the many different future uses we foresee. That's the background. That's the theoretical background for why it is set out the way it is set out now. There is, however, I think still the possibility for a combination of these things. That's what we tried here, actually, the line numbering. So the shell requirement has line numbering, and then there's a box with a unique identifier. We're trying to address both feedbacks that we have.
And just to add to that, this is Chelsea, there's a better way to present that visually. And as we talked about last week, we will be doing some work with a design agency to try and see how best to display this information as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you for raising that, Michael, and thank you for the response. Hopefully, we'll continue to have dialogue and thoughts about that, as it unfolds. So, this is the open question or other business section. So, is there anything else that board members would like to raise at this time? If not, I know Chelsea, you had requested potentially some time in teeing up our next discussion on the 25th, so maybe we could take that up now.
Sure, thank you, Eric. So this is the last set of slides, and I will just take a few minutes on this. But I just wanted to introduce the topics that we'll be discussing at the next call on the 25th of February. Because shortly after this meeting, if you haven't had them already, you'll be getting a set of, I think, 5 or 6 documents coming out. And I thought it will be more efficient use of your time if we introduce them here in just a couple of minutes and explain specifically the kind of feedback that we're looking for as you go through them. And we are all very aware that this is a lot of work we're requesting from the GSSB over this point in time. So we really do appreciate the effort you're putting in to help us out. So if you're looking at the second set of slides, and I'm afraid I haven't got them numbered, there's an agenda for GSSB call on the 25th of February. It has a short table on it. We've got 3 content agenda items to discuss with you. The first are 2 drafts of the topic-specific standards, and that is public policy and indirect economic impacts. So these will be part of the Group 1 category of standards that will go out for the early consultation beginning on the 19th of April. So these have been developed by the team using the templates that the GSSB reviewed and largely gave agreement on last week. Michael, your comments noted, and a few other minor amendments for us to consider making, bearing in mind. The second agenda item is a revised draft of SRS 201, general disclosures. Sorry, Judy, I just saw your comment come through. These are in the same slide deck that we've been looking at the back. The title is Agenda for GSSB Call on the 25th February. That's the slide title. I apologize for the technical challenges we're having today. So the second agenda item, which is the general disclosures, that is the further revision to the draft that you looked at last week with us. At that point, we had only the front sections built into the general disclosures, and we since have integrated the remainder of that content. And that is a discussion and feedback item. The draft is not yet at the point where we're asking for any kind of initial approval, but we do have a few things to highlight for the GSSB to give input on. And last, we have a paper which the division has worked on which is a proposal to discontinue 4 of the aspects as we move in this transition to SRSs. So looking at the next slide, public policy SRS and indirect economic impacts. These are 2 relatively short topic standards. They'll give you a good feel for how these SRSs will look and feel in practice once we get the template confirmed and we start to prepare actually the full set of topic standards. They have been developed using the template that you saw last week with the changes that were discussed and agreed upon by the GSSB last week. As you go through these, and they are quite short, fortunately for you, 2 things to bear in mind. One is the review of the use of instructive verbs. We have highlighted these for you in red, and several members of the team have been very diligent about going through and bringing in references to the previous wording from G4. So everywhere that we have highlighted an instructive verb, you should have in a comment box the original wording for you to be able to compare. And also touching on Michael's point earlier, we are also asking for feedback on the use of these 2 subheadings around disclosure methodology. So in the shorter standards, they may not be useful. There might be ways that we can revise or rename these subheadings that might be more appropriate, and your creative ideas are very welcome. Right. The second agenda item that we have on the call for you next week is to review the revised draft of the general disclosures. This slide highlights some of the key updates for you. So we've incorporated some of the content clarification issues which were discussed in December with the GSSB. We have, after further discussion and drafting, we've decided not to incorporate indicator G418 in the foundation standard, and we had discussed that with the GSSB last week. So you will be seeing it back in the general disclosures in its original home, and we have given you more detail on our rationale for that decision, which you can read in the paper. But in short, we found that when we actually went to draft the foundation standard with disclosures, there are a number of different disclosures that really relate closely to the reporting principles and the content in the foundation standard. So it became quite difficult and confusing to have some of those disclosures in the foundation standard, and some of them, like the stakeholder engagement related disclosures, or G419 around material topics, sitting in the general disclosures and some in the foundation standard. So that is our internal judgment call as we went through the drafting process, but that will be also for further feedback from the GSSB. We've made minor changes to G10, which relates to employment disclosures. And we've also incorporated input from the GSSB, I believe, from last year around the assurance disclosures in this draft. And all of those changes are highlighted for you. There's one section of this document which is still very much a work in progress. And if you look at the next slide, this is around the content index section. So I don't have a lot of the historical knowledge or the legacy knowledge related to the content index. But one of the challenges that we're having with this section is about figuring out really what the role and the purpose of the content index should be in these new SRS structures. And specifically, we would like to invite GSSB feedback to help us understand, is the level of disclosure and detail required by the current section appropriate for the intent and the nature of the new standards? Or do we need to be rethinking the nature and the role of this content index tool? Is there a more elegant way to help people structure and navigate through the different disclosures in the documents? So we anticipate hopefully a good discussion with you on that, and that initial feedback will help us to do some redrafting work that we think is quite necessary. Lastly, on the final slide now, proposal to discontinue 4 aspects. The Standards Division is proposing that as we make this transition into SRSs, there are 4 existing aspects in G4 that are either not strong enough or robust enough in their content to function as standalone standards. And we have given you several options for what would happen potentially to their content and how those indicators and guidance could be repurposed or relocated. So in that short paper, there's more detail and rationale on those proposed changes. Right, I realize that's quite a brief run through of what's on the agenda for the next call, but it will be quite a busy one. So I wanted to cover that with you today. Any questions on that?
Well, just a comment. I'm glad we have 2 weeks till the call.
Thank you, Eric.
I'm sure. So any questions from the board members? Any clarification? It is clear there's quite a bit of reading.
Yeah.
And, Kirsten, go ahead.
Yeah, we realized that this is quite a bit more reading. When will we receive the papers? And when will the survey be due?
Yes, the papers are ready to go out. Can be sent directly after this call, and the survey is also live, and we have attached into that paper a PDF of the survey questions as requested. So if you want to see what we're asking for feedback on, you have that laid out in front of you as well. So you can dig in right after this call. I think we'll let you off even a few minutes early if you want to use that time.
That's so kind of you, Chelsea. But thank you for sending it out in due time, at least.
Yeah,
I'm so excited.
Yeah.
I'm excited about getting off early.
Yeah, well, only a little bit. So I think I appreciate the fact that we had the time to do that preview, Chelsea. I think it's quite helpful, particularly in focusing the attention of the board on some of these more difficult issues, so that we can use our time wisely. It's further illustrates, and I do appreciate very much the board members that are using the survey document to highlight their questions, concerns. It is extremely helpful, and getting that in as early as possible is also quite helpful in terms of helping us structure the flow of the call, and also asking the Secretariat to focus on the areas of particular interest or concern to the board members. So very important, and appreciate, and it looks like compared from previous that more of the members are availing themselves of that survey instrument. So I'd ask everyone to continue with their diligence in doing that. So is there any other business, any other questions from the board? Okay, anything else, Bastian, from the Secretariat perspective?
No, thank you, Eric.
Okay, so in light of that, then we'll adjourn today's meeting and reconvene at the same time on February 25th for another robust and fruitful discussion of the transition to SRSs. So thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.